Yo ho ho, so today I'm going to be talking you through the best books that I read in 2019. So usually I play it safe and I pick my top 5, but this year I decided to shake things up a bit and I've pulled 17 books off my bookshelf that I want to talk about. So this is going to be a long one. I'm not going to go in chronological order of when I read each book. I'm actually just going to go in star rating. So the first is going to be 3 3-star books, then a load of 4-star books, and then finally 1 5-star book. So the first 3-star book was Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. So I read this purely because I felt like it was a classic that I should have read. I wasn't really that motivated to read it. I wasn't really drawn into the synopsis of the story. It isn't my typical thing that I like reading about. I'm not really one into reading about families and all that kind of stuff. And this really surprised me because it opened my eyes and it helped me realize that I can be very close-minded to certain classics. Like, I don't like reading classics. I like reading sort of cult stuff. I like reading books that I don't really hear other people talking about that often. So I am kind of put off by classics that get talked about all the time. But this was so refreshing to read. I did really enjoy it. It was so sweet. I think it's a completely unrealistic story about 4 sisters and the patience that they have for each other and the understanding that they have of their parents. I was reading this thinking this family dynamic would never really exist. I don't think it's possible. I'm an only child, so I wouldn't really know, but that's how I felt while reading it. It's really lovely. It was such a nice palate cleanser for what I'd been reading previously, because I was a bit depressed over the book that I had just finished before I started this. So I was glad to kind of get away from the usual things that I read and pick up something that's completely different in tone and just be able to lose myself in the world and actually really enjoy it. The next book is A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick. So I think this might have actually been the book that I read before reading Little Women. So you already kind of have my review for it. But I got really attached to the main character in this, who's Bob Arctor, who's an undercover agent who is trying to find the source of this new drug that's come out called Substance D, which is a really serious, dangerous drug that causes really bad hallucinations in whoever takes it and ultimately kills them. This book is a little bit confusing in the way that it's written because Bob Arctor is undercover, so he's going under different names. And for a little bit I was like, is that Bob or is that someone else? And then I realized, like, no, that is Bob. I was right the whole time. I wasn't expecting to be as moved by this as I was. I'd recommend this for people who are maybe just starting to get into sci-fi, because this is more of a thriller with sci-fi elements. It's not like 100% sci-fi futuristic sort of stuff, so don't be put off by that. Next is The Little Demon by Fyodor Sologub. This is why I didn't review this book at the time, because I was too self-conscious of pronouncing all the character names and the author's name, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So the main character in this is a man called Perdonov, and he's a school teacher, and he is just a horrible, cruel bastard. So if you're someone who likes reading asshole characters, this is definitely the book for you. This is so amusing, and it's just like you never find out why Perdonov is the way he is or why he's acting so cruel towards everyone in his life. As the story progresses, he begins to get more and more paranoid about certain things, and he's kind of paranoid to begin with anyway. But he's a school teacher who always verbally abuses his young students. He starts to tell lies to the students' parents just for his own amusement. He's just not a great character, and he's marrying his cousin for no other reason other than the fact that she could potentially get him a much better job than the one he's in, and all he's interested in is bettering his own life and moving forward in his life and using people to get what he wants. So if that sounds like your type of thing, I definitely recommend it. Don't be intimidated by the fact that it's Russian. I was kind of weirded out by that at first. I'm always intimidated by Russian lit. This is one that definitely reads as a contemporary despite the fact that it is actually a classic. I was super intimidated to read it at first, but once I actually got into the first couple of pages and realised it wasn't as hard as I was thinking that it would be, I was able to relax and just really enjoy the story. I found it so amusing. This is probably like the funniest book that I read all year. And now getting into the 4-star books with The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. So I got this from Rob for my birthday and I was so excited to finally read it. I tried reading Margaret Atwood previously. I tried getting into Oryx and Crake, just couldn't get into it for whatever reason. So I was a little daunted with reading this, worrying that maybe it's Margaret Atwood's writing style that doesn't really gel with me, but I was proven wrong. I was able to get really invested in the world and what Offred was going through. And I was so wrapped up in the story that I was really shocked by the abrupt ending of the novel. So that really kind of got me, and I didn't read anything for a couple of days after I finished this because I was just mulling over. I had so many thoughts about this at the time. I don't know if I'd really be interested in reading the Testaments. I think maybe this might work as a standalone story for me personally. I haven't heard great things about the Testaments, so I might just leave it. Next is my most recent 4-star read, which was I, Claudius by Robert Graves. So this took me ages to read, but it was so good. I think you would love this if you're someone who loves hearing about drama, who loves having a gossip. This is the book for you. Disregard the fact that it's historical fiction. That really doesn't affect the story. The characters are so petty. There's a lot of violence in it, which I suppose it shocked me, but I shouldn't really have been shocked because it is set in ancient Rome, which basically got you killed for anything. Some of the characters in this are so debaucherous, and it's all about power and, getting one over on someone else and having people killed just for the sake of getting their money or getting their house. There's so many characters in this book that I thought at first I'm going to have a really hard time with it, because usually I would, but you get to know the characters quite quickly because Claudius is repeating their names a lot, and that might be something that grates on people, but I felt like it was a great help as to getting to know who was who. There's also a family tree in the back of this book if you do actually get confused while you're reading it, and you can go look and see, oh yeah, so-and-so is related to this person and they're a descendant of that person. I had to maybe check it twice, and then I was okay with knowing who was who in the story. This was a very amusing read for me, and it was pretty fast paced, which I wasn't really expecting, and I just loved the way the story was told and we got to know so many characters. When I started reading this, I really didn't know if I was going to like it because I was so it's historical fiction. You don't read historical fiction, you're probably going to hate it. It goes to show that I can read stuff that isn't the typical genre that I'd pick up and still really enjoy it. The next book is The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. So this delivered on every single level that I thought it would just by reading the very first page of it. The first page just completely broke my heart, and immediately I knew I was in for an emotional ride, and that's really how I came away from this. So it does focus on James Baldwin's thoughts on the race relations in America, but it also primarily focuses on religion and the people who were converting to Muslim religion at the time, and I thought that was so interesting because it's never something that I've really thought about that much. I've heard about it in dribs and drabs, but it's something that I really don't have much background knowledge in. So yeah, this was definitely a really worthwhile read. It was very moving and very touching. I feel like this is a book that everyone should read regardless of who you are or what your background is. It's just very eye-opening. It's everything that I thought it was going to be and more. Then there's The Pumpkin Eater by Penelope Mortimer. So this is about Mrs. Armitage, who is a housewife in the 1960s, and it mainly is a story of how women had it back in the day and how if they were going through rough marriages, they basically had to put up with it. As we get to know her, we find out that she has a lot of emotional problems and a lot of problems in her marriage and problems connecting with her children, but she feels that her only purpose in life is just to have children, and she's got what is regarded as an army of children behind her, and she's on her third marriage and things aren't even going well in that. Her personal issues are causing such huge problems in her marriage that it's just really tumultuous, and it's a rough read, but it's definitely one that is very much based in truth. It's partially autobiographical. It's a very relatable story in the sense of I'm sure plenty of women back in the day had to go through what Mrs. Armitage goes through in this. If you like reading about women and mental health, I definitely recommend it. Then there's Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion. So I read this a couple of weeks ago and I absolutely loved it. No surprise there. I assumed that I was going to love it, and I did. Joan Didion's writing just never disappoints me. I could read all for her work, and I'm actually planning to do that one day. I plan to get through all of it. If you're someone who's into essays and you're someone who likes hearing about the 60s, I'd recommend this. Really interesting stuff, very varied in her writing. Like one of my favourite chapters was just about people who get married in Las Vegas. Really loved it. It's quite refreshing to read non-fiction every now and again. I'm definitely not reading it as much as I used to, but it's good to space things out now and again. Next is Haunted Castles by Ray Russell. So I know I've raved about this enough this year, but yeah, I really loved this. These are gothic short stories. They're really great. The first one's really creepy, and actually something I forgot to mention in my wrap up was that the main evil character in the first short story in this reminded me of the episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer called Hush, like those weird creatures that have that horrible smiley face. That's exactly how I pictured that character to look. So I think that's what made me really like that story even more. If I can relate it to pop culture in some way, pop culture that I specifically like, I'm gonna enjoy it. This is a really strong short story collection. I recommend it to anyone who's looking to get into gothic horror. It's a really good take and it has a mixture of different writing styles. But yeah, I absolutely loved this book. It was such a joy to read. It's such a great Halloween read. If you're looking for something to read next Halloween, you might want to check this one out. Then I have Invitation to a Beheading by Vladimir Nabokov. So this is a book that I've never really heard anyone else talk about on BookTube. And, you know, everyone has read Lolita for the most part. And you don't really hear other people talk about his other works. So I decided I should pick up some of his other books. And I started with this purely because it was like the cheapest book that I could get my hands on at the time. This is so peculiar and I feel like only Nabokov could have written this. It does have his traditional writing style of the fact that the writing itself is very beautiful. The story of Cincinnatus C is very odd. He is thrown in jail over a really unusual crime and no one will tell him when he is due to be executed. And that's all he wants to know is just when is he going to die? And that's all he wants to know is just when is he going to die because it's causing him severe anxiety and the guards are always messing with him in jail. And while reading this, it just occurred to me that Cincinnatus C seems like he's just living in a panto play. Every other character aside from him is just completely over the top and unbelievable and you just do feel really sorry for him that he's stuck with these people who don't really take him seriously, who aren't taking their jobs very seriously. And it has such a peculiar ending too. It's one of those stories that you kind of have to make up your mind about what happened in the end yourself. I definitely recommend this if you're someone who wants to check out more of Nabokov's work. The next one I want to talk about is Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grimscribe by Thomas Ligotti. So this is another short story collection, horror short stories. Again, I've raved about it. I loved this collection. The only one I really disliked was the first short story. I felt like that was just weird to have that in there. It didn't suit the rest of the stories that are in there. It didn't live up to the standard of the rest of the stories. Lots of different writing styles in this. What I loved most about this is that with each short story, for the most part, I couldn't predict the ending of. And I love being taken by surprise, especially with horror, since horror can be so terribly predictable. It was just really enjoyable to read something where I was like, I have no idea where this story is going to end, but I'm here for the journey. And most of them are pretty short, so you definitely get a lot of bang for your buck with this. But yeah, it was just, it was so wonderful. I wish I could relive it again. I'm kicking myself for leaving it on my bookshelf for so long unread because it was just such a joy to read and get through. And now some more short stories with Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. So I'd never been super motivated to read this book either. It's something I've heard multiple booktubers talk about over the years, and it's never been something that I've naturally gravitated to. I don't really like fairy tales that much. So fairy tale retellings, I was kind of like, well, what's the point? I probably wouldn't enjoy this. Over time, like hearing about Angela Carter, I thought, maybe I should actually get around to reading it. So I did, and I ended up really enjoying it. My favourite stories in this was the Red Riding Hood retellings. I thought they were brilliant. They were completely not what I expected them to be. They were just hardcore. The way she flipped some of them on their head was just really, really cool to me, and it's not something that I'd really thought about. I think it showed me that I don't have to disregard certain books just because they're retellings. Like I've always thought like the idea of a retelling is kind of cheap. When it's done well, it's completely worthwhile. Then I have Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides. So if you know me, you'd know that I hate Jeffrey Eugenides. I read The Virgin Suicides years ago, absolutely hated it, detested it, swore off Eugenides' work for good. And then I saw this in a used bookstore and decided to get it. And I've heard people rave about this and say that this is his best novel. So I decided to give it a chance, and it's been sitting on my bookshelf for a couple of years now, and I thought that this was going to be the year that I actually read it. And if I hated it, well, it can go back to the used bookstore, and if I like it, well, then that's a bonus. And I ended up absolutely loving this. I'm not really one for like family dramas or just reading about the family dynamics in general. They're an immigrant family. They're from Greece originally. And the main character, Cal, recounts his childhood and his adolescence and just everything that went into him becoming the person that he is today. And I don't know what it, like, I can't really put my finger on it, but like I felt like there wasn't anything bad about this book. One of the things that was a big tell of how much I enjoyed this was the fact that when I put it down, I'd immediately want to pick it back up. When I was out and about and thinking about when I was going to be getting home and doing more reading, I was genuinely excited to be coming home. There's a lot of family history, and I think that's the main element in this that I absolutely loved. Hearing about Cal's parents getting together and like the family secret. It was just so entertaining to read. The story really took me everywhere. It was heartwarming, but it was also emotional. And again, it's just another book that really impressed me this year. It's, like I said, it's something I wouldn't normally pick up, but I'm so glad that I did. And it has turned me around on Jeffrey Eugenides completely, and on authors that I've written off in general. You know, I'm thinking now, maybe I shouldn't dismiss authors just because I've read one of their books and I just didn't like it. Maybe I should give certain authors a second chance. And next is the final short story collection that I'm going to be talking about. It's Dubliners by James Joyce. So this was the first book that I read this year, and my main goal for 2019 was to finally read some Joyce and see what the big fuss is about. I loved this, and I think it's probably the reason why I loved it is probably like the Irish thing. There's a lot of like Irish isms or things that are typically Irish in this, especially the first short story where it's about the two young boys. I think that's what brought up my enjoyment of this, whereas like if it was set somewhere else, I probably really wouldn't have enjoyed it. I felt like the short stories in the first half of the book were definitely stronger than the stories in the latter part. There was only one short story in this that I really took a disliking to, which is in the middle of the book, called Grace, and it's because the language in it is very repetitive. There was a lot of he said, she said, he replied, she responded, he said, and when that happens, when authors do that, I get very, very distracted by that, and it takes away from what the characters are actually saying because I'm more focused on the description afterwards. I felt like that was the one story where Joyce got lazy, but aside from that, it's a really decent collection. I feel like it was a lot easier to read than I had anticipated. Now I know that this is probably the best place to start with Joyce, but I'm looking forward to reading more of his work in the future. I feel positive. I feel like it is definitely something that I can attempt and I will be able to comprehend. And like I said, I really enjoyed this because of the Irish aspect to it. You know, I don't really read Irish authors that often, but maybe I should be making the effort to do it more. So now finally for my top 3 books of the year. The first one is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. So over the years, people would comment on my videos saying, if you love dystopian fiction, you have to read Brave New World. And I always had this guilt over not having read it yet. So I knew that this year was going to be the year that I was going to read it. And I did read it and I loved it. And I wished, my main problem with it was that I wished that it was longer, because it goes by so quickly that it's kind of like blink and you miss it. It was such an addictive binge read for me. Once I finished it, I just wished I had more, and I wished I had appreciated the time reading it more, even though I did really appreciate it. So this is about Bernard Marx, who is living in this dystopian society, and he's very displeased with his placement in life. And the overheads end up hearing about his dissatisfaction with where he is, and that he isn't thinking the way everyone else is brought up to think. So they end up sending him off to what is referred to as the Savage Reservation, where it's a load of people who live outside of this society who still live like regular people. So the main thing in this is that babies are now cloned, but the people who live on these reservations still have babies naturally, and that's something that's really looked down upon, and that's why they're referred to as savages, because they still pray to the old gods and they still live like normal people. Where in the new society, babies are cloned and people don't have babies naturally anymore, and they're all into this kind of like hedonism lifestyle, and they have this motto that's kind of like, I belong to everyone, and it's kind of, I don't know, it's real skeevy. It's something I wasn't really expecting. It's such a great dystopian novel. Like, I can see why people are saying like this is the dystopian novel of, like, if you're going to read any dystopian, read Brave New World. And there are lots of great dystopian novels, but I feel like this just really impressed me. I knew I was going to love it, and it was just so exciting to read something that I knew I was going to love right off the bat. And I really appreciated my reading experience while I was actually reading it. And like I said, my main thing was that I just wished it was longer, because there's a few different themes in this that I thought could have been drawn out a bit more. But anywho, yeah, Brave New World, fantastic read. So next up is Dune by Frank Herbert. So Rob got this for me for my birthday, and he was really motivational in telling me that like he believes that I could read it, because I was always really intimidated to read Dune. I always thought that I wouldn't be able to understand it, that the story was going to be too complex, that there was going to be too many characters to keep track of. So I always just put it on the long finger. But when I got it, I knew that I was going to read it, and I pretty much read it straight away, and I absolutely loved this. Like, I can't see why people would dislike this. I saw like a negative review maybe a couple of weeks after I had finished it, and I was like, I was like slightly offended. This was like the binge read book of the year for me. I was so addicted to it. I got through it really, really quickly, but I read it at my own pacing. I didn't like skim through it or try to get through it as fast as possible. I definitely read it at a normal pace to take in as much information as possible, because yeah, there are a good few characters in it, and there's a lot of stuff. The story kind of goes back and forth, but it's basically about this boy called Paul. He's living on a planet that's basically like a dust planet, and his people are being told that if they were to move to a different planet, they wouldn't be able to survive, that only they can survive on this planet. His family are feuding with another family. It's very political, and that's something that I love. I know a lot of people don't, but that's something that I just really loved about it. And I just got so invested in Paul's story, and to see what would happen to him and his mother. It was just so, like, I was so happy to read it, and I just couldn't believe that I'd put it off for so long. Like, if you're someone who has been putting it off, like, don't put it off, just read it. If you're in the mood to read it, then pick it up, because it is like an absolutely fantastic novel. And now finally, my only 5-star book of the year was House of Leaves by Margaret Danielewski. So, like I said, for multiple other books, I really procrastinated on this. This was my 4th time trying to read it, and I decided that if I wasn't going to be able to get through it this time, I'm just going to give the book to charity, because it's a hard book to read. It's not set up in a way like a normal novel, as you'll know if you've flipped through it in a bookstore or at a library. And I think I read it at the most perfect time, because it's set up as if it's a real academic journal. And because I was reading a lot of academic journals for college at the time, that was the most perfect time to get my head finally into this book. So basically, I think a lot of people try to make this sound a lot more complicated than it actually is. So we start off with the character of Johnny, who is kind of, I would regard him as kind of like a crumb bum. He's like a bit of a lowlife. He's looking for a new apartment, and one of his friends say, like, check out this apartment in my building. The old man who lived there just died, so why don't you just go and have a look and see if it's something you'd be interested in. So Johnny investigates this apartment, and in the apartment he finds an academic journal called the Navidson Record. And that's when the story of the Navidson family actually starts. But the format of this is that it cuts back and forth between the actual academic journal and then Johnny's own thoughts. And there's a lot of interjecting, and it just cuts it off right across the page, which is something that irritates me. I hate that in novels. I know that it's authors trying to be like quirky and things, but it drives me up the wall. So once you actually get past that, it wasn't until about the 200-page mark that I actually started enjoying this, because this isn't something that you read for fun. This feels like work, and I've said that before. But once you get past the hurdle of actually getting into the story and into the book in general, you're going to fly through it. The format of this book and the amount of work that went into creating it really impressed me. This is one of those books that gives you as much information as possible, and then it's up to you as a reader to decide what's actually going on in the story, who's telling the truth. Is this house that they're talking about even real? The house that is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. There's so many possibilities as to what's actually happening in this story. I've never read anything like it. The reading experience itself was so unique, and I know I'll never experience anything like it ever again, and that's why I gave it 5 stars. So those have been the 17 books that really impressed me this year. So let me know if you've read any of them. Let me know what your favorite books of the year were, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.